In 10 minutes at 5 after the hour. We'll begin in about 5 minutes. We'll be getting started in 3 minutes. Good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you out to the Masonic seminar series. My name is Brother Katie Kumsier, and I am in the office here at Universal Co-Masonry with Brother Patrick Alessandra and Brother Benjamin Hartle, who are running our various platforms that we are streaming on, including Zoom, X, Facebook, YouTube, the whole bunch. So I want to welcome everybody and thank them for their time. This evening, we will be looking at a brief history of Universal Co-Masonry. And I say brief because there's a lot to it. So even though I say brief, we're going to spend a good hour and a half talking about that. Before we start, we'll start with the do's and don'ts, as we have some new people that join us every month. The Masonic Seminar Series was created back in 2018 to help create a place where questions can be answered and curiosity can be met without divulging any secrets about Masonry. Universal Masonry hosts the Masonic Seminar Series, as well as the Masonic Philosophical Society, which is our other organization, which is also free and open to the public. It has a very different platform than we do here. It is a lecture-based, episodic seminar where you would listen to me for an hour and a half talk about the various things of Freemasonry. Each month is a standalone, so if you're joining us for the first time, you have not missed out on anything that would require you to have previous knowledge for today. So sit down, settle in, hopefully you have your tea or coffee, and you have questions that will abound for tonight's lecture. Speaking of questions, if you are coming in from one of our platforms outside of Zoom, Brother Patrick will be get your voice. So if you have questions, I will stop and they will ask your questions for you. And Brother Benjamin will be running our Zoom platform. So if you have any questions, please send it to Brother Hartle so he can help you with your questions, and he will also let me know what those questions are. Please keep in mind that the questions, we want to keep them on point so that we don't distract from tonight's presentation. So if your question is not addressed, either it wasn't on point or we weren't able to get to it, and I apologize ahead of time. So please keep that in mind. I will stop periodically for questions. I really hope you take the opportunity to use that platform so that I can address anything that comes up. I think that is the do's and the don'ts. I don't think I've forgotten anything. So we'll get started with tonight's presentation. Again, I just want to say that what you see each month is what I have studied over the last 20 years of being a Mason with Universal Co-Masonry. So I do not speak on behalf of the order. I am just a representative that is sharing a viewpoint. So if you have spoken with other Masons that are UCM Masons or maybe another obedience, they might have a different opinion. And that doesn't mean that they are wrong or I am right or vice versa. It just means that there's a variation in opinion. All right, so let me share my presentation with you. 1 second, please. All right, as I said, we're going to look at the history of Freemasonry in general, but really to parse out the lineage of Universal Co-Masonry. And the reason why I felt that this was a really important topic to address is because oftentimes you will hear in the Masonic community two words that I believe that are highly used and highly misunderstood. And so I'd like to kind of clear that out so that we can have an honest conversation. The first word I'd like to address is clandestine. Clandestine means that a lodge or an order is operating without a recognized authority. And that there's a caveat on the word recognized, which I will address here with the second definition as well, which is regular. They're very similar, clandestine and regular. Regular means that they are recognized, the lodge or Masonic order, they are recognized by a ruling authoritarian Masonic body, but they are not doing that. They're following the Masonic customs and traditions that are laid out. So landmarks, rituals, that type of stuff, the interpretation thereof. The problem with the word recognized is that who's the recognizing governing body amongst Masonry? That's like asking who recognizes all of Christianity, who recognizes all of Islam or Judaism? Like, who's the recognizing body? A lot of people will point to the United Grand Lodge of England because that is the oldest Grand Lodge, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have the absolute all global authority to recognize or not recognize. So there becomes this tug of war between people when they want to say, well, I don't recognize your organization because it's clandestine. And that means that they don't recognize the governing body. So That's actually, this presentation actually came out of the years and years that I've heard that, this organization or that organization is clandestine. Um, Universal Co-Masonry has been called clandestine, and erroneously so, because they say that we allow women, which we do, and I'm proof of that. That would mean that we would be irregular because that we're not following the landmarks of their established organization. So we're not clandestine and we're not irregular. It matters on what you believe are the landmarks for Masonry, for the regularity, and it matters who do you believe to be the governing authority that will say, yes, you are a Masonic body, or no, you're not. And that's what gave birth to this whole presentation, because so many people use that word. I see it on our platforms with the Masonic Philosophical Society, where people are like, oh, this organization is clandestine, that one's not. And they don't know the meaning of the words. Usually, there's definitely some educated Masons out there that use it well, but the majority doesn't. So that kind of front loads a little bit of like why this presentation has been born, because I think it's really important. One, I don't believe in insults, but if insults are going to be thrown, such as being clandestine or irregular, we should know the definition of that, and we should know the history, because there really is some faulty footholds on that. It's a lot of sand. So let's look at what we're going to do in the next hour and a half. I have broken it up into two parts. The first one is we're just going to look at the ancient world through early modern era. Obviously, I'm not going to go in depth. If there's some history buffs here that know everything about everything, I'm just going to top the surface of it, because again, we only have an hour and a half to get there. And the second part is we're going to go from early modern era to present day. And this is where you really see Universal Co-Masonry make a major distinction outside of other organizations. It's not that we're new, it's that as our history has evolved, it has become more distinctive. The way I like to frame it is it's like geographical isolation, if you know anything about evolution, where you start out with one species, and as geography, or in this case, time, starts to advance, the species starts to diverge from a common ancestor forward into something new. A great example are the squirrels in the Grand Canyon. You had them starting out as one species, and then as the Grand Canyon formed over millions of years, the squirrels got separated by a massive, whole, if you will, got, separated and became distinctly different species in the length of their tail, coloration of the fur, that type of stuff. So if you want to tie that into Masonry, you'll see as organizations start to evolve out of 1717, that's where you start to see that kind of Masonic speciation, as we call it, starting to bloom, and a phylogenetic tree coming out of it. And we'll see again in that second half of our presentation today, which is probably the last third of our presentation, where you see really us going from a very generic, this is Freemasonry and this is kind of the birth, to a very specific, this is, this is where we're following that branch, which is Universal Co-Masonry. All right. So this is kind of the timeline of the first half. It is a lot. I hopefully will not bore you to tears, but I wanted to just kind of give you a layout of where we're going. We're going to start in the upper left-hand corner, and one of my favorite parts, which is the ancient mystery schools. This is where, if you are a lover of Masonic historicity, you will find that this is where most people will disagree, which is the origin of Masonry. And I will hopefully lay out a argument that will be compelling enough for you to see how Freemasonry on the whole is hailing back from the ancient mystery schools. And we'll look at the Western esoteric tradition in brief. We'll look at Theodosius I and his havoc that he reigned across the pagan community in the Eastern Roman Empire and then all Roman Empire. We'll go all the way up through into the 1800s, late 1800s, to Maria de Resme, who is extremely important. As you can tell, she is a female, and you'll find out she's a Mason. So that's the first half, and then I'll show you the second half as we go. And like I said, I'm going to stop probably a little bit later to see if there's any questions. I anticipate probably more questions when we get into the second half or the last third of our presentation, because that's where you really see a lot of history that is in recent memory for some of us here. I will say I tried very hard to be objective. I didn't try to gloss over anything, especially in the latter parts of history. History is not meant to be beautiful. It's meant to be lived, and you will find that there are some ups and there are some heavy downs in it in the history. And I tried to present those as equally across the board. Relax. I'm not going to read this to you. I'm pretty sure you can all read. So if you want, you can go all the way through this. But this one slide could be books and volumes of books on the various different mystery schools, ancient mystery schools, cults. And when I use the word cults, I'm using it in the classic sense as religious schools, not in the modern day, brainwashing that has come to me. So when we look at Freemasonry, Freemasonry, there's an argument that it just started with the building guilds in the Middle Ages, medieval era, officially codified and formalized in 1717 with the Premier Grand Lodge. But I would argue it goes further back. And the reasons why is if you look at the rituals of Masonry, there's something that is transcendent about the rituals, whether the practitioner knows it or not, that is hails back from all of these older schools, the cult of Mithras, the Pythagorean schools. You have a bunch of just different mystery schools of this time when you're looking at even Aristotle's Academy. Like there's all this buildup that even carries all the way up through the Age of Enlightenment into, I guess it would be the end of the Renaissance into the Age of Enlightenment with the Royal Society and secret colleges or invisible colleges, which I would also contend that Masonry, the lodge, is an invisible college. And what I'm saying by that is when you look at the different rituals that we can pull from the ancient mysteries that exist, like the cult of Mithras is very, you can go and see, I've been to Italy and I've seen the various temples and they're beautiful. And you can see the symbolism that's even today in Masonry in our lodges. There's the rites of Orpheus, which is hard to find anything on, but there are some testimonies that we're aware of that talks about ritual, that there are elements that today we have and do in our ceremonies that hail back from these various schools. So it's a bit of a mosaic. When you look at Masonic origin, we say in Masonry that it comes from time immemorial, and I'll tell you why that is in a minute. We don't really know when we started, but we've tried to follow the, crumbs that have been laid over history and try to interpolate back to where we started. And again, there's those who will say 1717 because they're looking for kind of written word. And there are those of us that are looking for the spirit of Masonry. And that's something that hails back even further than the rites of Orpheus. You can look back into, Egyptian rituals and whatnot to see where this is coming from. And the reason why we say time immemorial, I would argue that it comes from the idea that there is a perennial wisdom or a perennial faith. When I say faith, I don't mean it in traditional kind of traditional language. I feel like when I talk Masonry, I talk really old English. And in a sense, we do. It's very old. We're not using modern day definitions. So when we look at it, we're hailing back to a time that is unknown. And it has to do, again, with all of the similarities and the continuity that happens throughout time. And that perennial wisdom, which someday, maybe in the near future, I will present on, talks about kind of an epicenter. Think of it as a Big Bang if you want, a spiritual Big Bang, where you have this concentrated center of spirituality. And I'm not talking like a civilization or people, I'm talking about an idea. I'm talking about, the cluster of principles and virtues and thought forms that came together in a super compressed moment. And then over time and through, various cultural expressions, it erupted and it has shattered across time. And that is why you'll find truth in anything if you're looking for it. You also find a lot of falsities because, I don't know, falsities. I mean, there are things that are false, but things it's just left up to interpretation. And so Masonry comes from time immemorial. It's coming from a place that is birthed in a place of transformation. And the ancient mystery schools were all about, in its various expressions, about transformation, how to reconnect the individual to the divine. And depending on where you were, depending on what school you were a part of, would be the different rites that you would do, whether it was the rites of Persephone and the rites of Dionysus, or moving into Mithra, whatever it was, or Christianity, early Gnosticism, you'll see that Masonry has pieces of that. And perhaps that's why we speak a lot of Old English in Masonic rituals, or Old Spanish or Old Portuguese, is because we're talking about a long, long time ago and reinterpreting that experience through a modern worldview. I am going to read you this last quote on the very end of this slide, which says, Freemasonry represents the modern incarnation of the ancient mystery tradition. This tradition, these great mysteries, are not fantasies of fiction. They are the heritage of all human beings. I love that part. The inclusivity that it's for anyone who wants to do it, it's there for them. Doesn't mean you have to do it, but it doesn't say, well, you're not good enough, or you're not the right shade of skin color, or you're not the right sex. It doesn't say any of that. It's all of our heritage. Every one of us shares this heritage together. The mysteries are the gateway to the human evolution and the pathway to the future. As wonderful as each one of us are, we are incomplete. And the ancient mysteries, and Freemasonry, as the daughter of the ancient mysteries, is trying to make us complete again. And I would argue not by changing us, but by utilizing what is already within us and realigning it to the good, the true, and the beautiful to help us live a life that is worthy of the future that we all dream of. Universal Co-Masonry recognizes that these mysteries cannot only be preserved and remembered, they must be practiced and continued so that the flames that they ignite in the minds of humanity must never be extinguished. Very poetic. It's one thing I say often, and I apologize to those who've heard me say it quite a bit. There's theoretical Masons who talk about all sorts of things and, idea, and there's applied Masonry. Universal Co-Masonry is applied Masonry. We're that latter group where we're taking all those thoughts and ideas and we're looking at all the pieces and we're trying to live them. And, sometimes we do a great job, as individuals, and sometimes, just like all humans do, we trip and fall and we fail in the way that we do it. And that's okay, because Masonry is a very human experience, but it has to be practiced, else it means nothing. Oftentimes people will say, well, what do I get out of Masonry? Which I can't say I'm a big fan of that, the way the question is styled. But whatever you put into it. It is literally the Mary Poppins bag. If you remember that movie, like, where whatever you put in is what you can get out. Like, it's gonna be everything, or it will be nothing, or whatever, it is in between. But ultimately, the base of that bag resides in the ancient mystery. So when you are putting stuff in there, you are touching something that you cannot physically touch in time. You are touching it with another part of your body, whether it be the mental or the spiritual aspect of you. So the Western esoteric tradition, again, every slide could probably be its own presentation, which I will not do, but the Western esoteric tradition is very unique in that it has a lot of, it's kind of like the spoke on a wheel. And the Western esoteric tradition is Western because it's, born in ancient Greece, the bedrock of modern Western thought and philosophy. It's esoteric because it's meant for a small group of people. In modern times, a lot of people don't like the idea that it's only meant for a few. I don't know if I have a problem with that, because if you want it, you can receive it. Just like anything, you have to work for it. I was talking with a brother earlier in the month, and we were talking about the quote that many are called, but few are chosen. And I've liked that quote, but I've always wondered, like, what's the metric for being chosen, right? Because that means selection. That means some are going to make the cut and some aren't. And is that a spiritual chosen? Does that mean, like, the great architect is coming down and saying, you, not you, like, that gets to be it's an important question, because it gets to be very divisive right away. And I came across later in life an expansion on that quote, which was, many are called, but few choose to be chosen. And it made more sense the way I saw that, or the way it was presented to me, because we are chosen because we choose to be chosen. And that means we are living the way that is in accordance with the great architect's grand design of the universe. And the Western esoteric tradition is looking at that idea of that secret or personal or inner knowledge that's meant for a few, that it is given through the perspective or the lens of Western philosophy. So that's why it's the Western esoteric tradition. And there's seven of them, of which Freemasonry is a part of. Um, the one that I didn't put on here is Freemasonry. But you have Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, and then you have the sciences. So the top four, with addition of Freemasonry, is the traditions, and then the occult sciences. Notice that's occult, meaning hidden, which is astrology, chemistry, alchemy, and theurgy or ceremonial magic. And when we say the word magic, I try not to use that word because it's been taken hostage in modern times to mean like, sleight of hand, to be duped, that type of stuff. But it's ceremonial magic. The real true word is a theurgy. It is the creation of something beyond what you can see when you do different types of ritual. One ritual that is, I don't know if it's gone out of vogue, but it's definitely changed over the last several generations, is the ritual of marriage. Um, it has a ceremony to it, and it's the alchemical marriage, it's the coming together of two opposites, forming a completion to create a new entity that creates something stronger than just the parts by themselves. So the Western esoteric tradition, you'll see, to tie this into history, is that moving through time, you'll have, from the mystery schools, you will see it create and evolve into these various Western esoteric traditions. And all of them, all of humanity is connected in its experience of occult knowledge. But again, this is through the perspective of Roman Greek ideas and thoughts and language. So you have these eight, including Freemasonry, that are going to evolve out of the ancient mystery schools. So and again, I did what last year? I think I did every single one of these for like a month. I did a presentation on each of these. They're on our YouTube channel if you want to look at them. Someday I'll revisit them, not this day and not next month, but if you want to look at each one of these individually, by all means, you can look them up on YouTube. But I will go through this next slide and then stop and see if there's any questions from either platforms that pertain to what we've talked about so far. So you see that spirituality is thriving in its unique form as we go from the ancient mystery schools, moving through the Western esoteric tradition. You have various lenses. Gnosticism is going to be very Christian, early Christian mysticism. You have Hermeticism, which is going to be more of your kind of Hellenistic perspective, that fusion of Egypt and Greece. And then you have all of these different ones. Kabbalah is going to be Jewish. You have all of these thriving schools and thoughts and ideas that are out there. Well, that comes to a very bloody halt in about 381 with Theodosius I. So he continues on Constantine the Great's ban on anything that is non-Christian. And so if you look at all of the mystery traditions and the Western esoteric traditions and like how long, like when they were born in time and when they stopped being practiced, as far as we know, there's a big line on 381 AD because there was this persecution. It became illegal for a lot of these pagan traditions to be practiced. Before they were tolerated, sometimes they were persecuted. They were tolerated, but when Constantine the Great came in and said, well, nope, we're going to do Christianity, we're going to unite the empire together under one religion, then we're going to see that this comes to a screeching halt. A lot of the traditions did just stop right there in 381. Some of them went underground and would persist throughout, up until 1717 when they start to resurface and coming out. Not all of them survived. But there's some things that were stopped by Theodosius that some people would argue were a good thing, which was the Etruscan process of divination, which they would sacrifice animals and then they would divine futures through the liver and the entrails of that. Modern day, we might see that as a good thing. Back then, that was a religious practice, and Theodosius stopped that. Again, trying to get the entire empire to come under one religion. I'm going to stop here and see if there's any questions or comments. Brother Patrick.
So we have a question from the YouTube chat. How does Masonry view works such as Isis Unveiled and the Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky? Or do they have any opinion on them at all?
So we'll get to, at least we'll talk about Andy Besant, but with H.P. Blavatsky, there's no official stance from Universal Co-Masonry on the Secret Doctrine or Isis Unveiled. However, they're encouraged to read it because we are encouraged to read everything. So there's no official stance. So you'll have some members who are very intimate with those particular books. There are some that have never read it, but it's not like it is a you have to read it or not have to read it. There's no book list that is banned from Freemasonry in Universal Freemasonry. So you can read them. I personally think they're excellent books in that they provide a lot of wisdom and that taken with a spiritual criticism that it can be very, very helpful. But for as the order stands, there's no particular one way or the other. Brother Benjamin.
Can you briefly go over what it means to be Western esoteric tradition versus where the delineation is with Eastern and how those go together?
Yeah, so the Western, so it's kind of hard because it's really one massive river. So in my head, I look at spirituality or esotericism like a massive, massive river, and it's going obviously one direction. On one side is us, on the other side is where we're trying to get. And these esoteric waters, it's hard to break them apart and say like, okay, well, the river has forked, and you have Western esoteric and you have Eastern, because they all come from that same well of spirituality, that cosmic spirituality. The Western esoteric tradition is going to be born out of Western philosophy, Western civilization. So we're looking at the Hellenistic point, and forward. But it has, like I said, Hellenistic, which means Greek and Egyptian fused together. So, you know, Egypt from there going into the Far East, you're going to see all of that knowledge coming through Egypt up into Greece and Rome, and then being disseminated across the Western hemisphere. So they're really not separate, but we separate them because there is a distinct shift in worldview. You have the Western philosophy and the Western civilizations that see the world very different than our Eastern counterparts. And it's not a splitting of like, well, one's right and one's wrong. They're just looking at the same truth with different worldviews. So I would put a kind of a rough line in the water, if you can ever draw a line in the water, that is going to be that Hellenistic point, maybe even a little bit behind that. That's when you're going to start to see the Western esoteric tradition. Incidentally, and as a side comment, the reason why Masonic Seminars series was created was because we were seeing a large number of people coming from the African continent and Eastern traditions, and they really had a hard time with the viewpoints of Freemasonry, because Freemasonry is a Western esoteric tradition, because that's the viewpoint that it's been put through. And so we created this very platform to help show a different way of viewing it, to get them, the people that were interested, to see it through a different worldview, which is, I mean, imagine, you know, going to another country that is not a Western country and experiencing a totally different world. That's ultimately what has happened with Masonry. Excuse me. So I would say right about that beginning of the Hellenistic period. Are there any other questions? We good? Okay. All right. Moving forward. All right, so let's get into it. So this is a big jump. So we have 381 AD with Theodosius I. We're jumping all the way to 1425. I could even put it maybe to pre-1400s, 1390, with the Regius manuscript or the Halliwell manuscript, depending on how you want to call it, and the first Masonic Lodge. So this is a big gap, because you got to keep in mind that we have that kibosh on pagan religions. The temples, many of the temples, pagan temples, were ransacked. And again, I'm using, you know, Christian language, calling them pagan. They were ransacked, burned to the ground, all that good stuff. I don't know if it's good, but all that stuff that goes with history. And so you see everything kind of shift that could survive goes underground. And we have in 1390, we have the Regius manuscript, which comes out. It's the oldest known Masonic document that we have, that is literally, it talks 13 points of like instruction and principles, like outside of virtue and morality. It talks about how to be a master and all that stuff. Um, it is believed that the surviving Western esoteric traditions and occult schools were brought into and infused across kind of that undercurrent of the medieval era and was kind of sitting safely underneath cathedrals. Not like in real time, but like metaphysically speaking, it's sitting underneath there in the protection of the guilds. And this Regis manuscript is what really anchors Masonry as a starting point, kind of the proto-Masonry to 1717. What you see on the left of your screen is a copy or picture of that document. And on the right is the first Masonic lodge that is documented, that we know that there might have been some, we speculate, we don't know, we speculate that there might be some lodges that were before. But when we look at written history and documentation, the Mary's Chapel or the Lodge of Edinburgh in #1 in Scotland is the first lodge that we know of that has written documents of a Masonic meeting. So it's minutes, because every lodge meeting that we have, we keep minutes because we like to keep a record of history. So that is the oldest that we have, 1598, of an actual Masonic lodge. The interesting thing going back to the Regis manuscript is it has in there a legendary story of how Masonry ties back to Egypt through Euclid. So again, it's not like we just like made this like jump over the Grand Canyon of, the Middle Ages. There's this thread, and I would argue it's a kind of strong thread of a connection between Egypt and Freemasonry. And again, it's considered a legendary history. There's no other proof outside of the statement that it's in the document itself. So the Regis manuscript is often brought up in Masonic circles as the oldest document of Masonry that we know of. And then again, Lodge of Edinburgh, #1 in Scotland, being the oldest minutes that we have on record for, and again, this is for all of Freemasonry. It's not just Universal Co-Masonry. This is all of Freemasonry going back from this lineage. All right, so let's get to the brass tacks of modern masonry. So this is the spreading of Freemasonry throughout Europe, so continental masonry, as well as Anglo-Masonry or English Masonry. This picture in the middle is Freemasonry teaching the people, and it is a very symbolic piece of art. It's one of my favorites, and it's very, if you take the chance just to look at it and just kind of, if you like symbolism, you can see a lot of pieces of history and a lot of pieces of symbolism in there that speak to just the moralistic foundation that Freemasonry had, which is interesting because the Regis manuscript of 1390 it has moral grounds. It's talking about how to live an upright and virtuous life. So Masonry has always been about morality, which hails back to the definition of what is Freemasonry, a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So it's a system of attuning yourself to the good, the true, and the beautiful, veiled in allegory. So it's told through story, and then it is going to be told to you by story in the process of symbols. And what you see here next to this particular image is going to be the various crests of lodges that play a huge part of the Masonic history. And I would say not just lodges, but obediences. All right. So let's talk about the schism. When we look at the schism, there's lots of schisms. 1717 was the first schism, which this one is not talking about. This is talking about the schism of the schism. So let me back up. Let's go to this slide. So 1717, you have 4 lodges that come together and say, let's form a Grand Lodge that is a governing body, which is called the Premier Grand Lodge, is its like official name. Its unofficial name was the Grand Lodge of England. And so 1717, they form, and that's when 1723, you see Anderson's constitutions coming out, which is going to, talk about who can be accepted and who can't in Masonry. And you start to see the formalizing and the codifying of Freemasonry as we know it today. Now, the problem with the Premier Grand Lodge is that it had started to have a schism itself, and it would break apart into 2 lodges and eventually 2 obediences. One was called the Ancients, and one was called the Moderns. And there's the real reason why many believe that there was a schism, and then there's the reason that the rest of the world is told to not look so bad. But the real reason is that there was kind of, in my opinion, I speculate the real reason is that it was a class warfare. You had the moderns who said that anyone could be a Mason, it didn't have to be nobility, and the ancients said, nope, you have to have title and pedigree. And so there was that fight. What most people would say is the schism, what caused the schism was because you had the idea, like masonry was just exploding across Europe and the early Americas. Like it was crazy. I was just talking the other day at a lodge function about how in before 1826 in New York, you had over 480 lodges in New York alone, which was 20,000 members. And then at 1826, you have the Morgan Affair, which completely deflates this big boom of Freemasonry. But up until that point, until 1826, at least in the Americas, and then you'll see that impact in with World War One in continental Europe, you will see that Masonry is just exploding and flourishing, and you're seeing all sorts of different Masonic rites coming out of this. So you're seeing not only do you have the lodge or the rites of perfection with 25 degrees, you also have the strict observance coming out of Germany. Then you have the rectified Scottish rite, which is going to take the strict observant and tinker with it and streamline it down from 7 degrees to 6 degrees. And you have Memphis Mizraim and Cagliostro. You have all of these people and names that I'm not even saying that are just seeing Masonry evolve from this very quiet underground existence in the Middle Ages and just exploding in 1700s, 1800s. And the moderns and the ancients, what they tell the argument is that most people are aware of is that the ancients said there's all of these other degrees and all these other rites that are coming out. That's not Masonry. That's not pure Masonry, as they called it. There's only the first 3 degrees. You have the inter-apprentice, fellow craft, and master mason. That's it. The moderns were like, no, there's more to that. Like, this is like the classic example of arguing between, the modern, the conservative and the progressives, whatever, your political system is. There's always that tug of war, and it was found in Masonry in the 1717, where it was like, no, there's more to pure Masonry than just the first 3 degrees. There's what we would call the Holy Royal Arch of Jerusalem. That's also a part of it. So it wasn't that they accepted everything, the moderns. They just said, no, this extra degree here, this degree is also a part of the story. And they would fight for 60 years. And then early 1801, I think it was, you'll see that they'll reconcile. And that reconciliation is why we have the product of the United Grand Lodge of England. That is why it's called United. So that's like the original schism, which gives us to the second and the third schism that we'll see. So what you'll see from England, you have the United Grand Lodge of England, and it will start to spread all through Europe and, as I said, early America and into Canada. And you'll see that you'll have the formation in France. It wasn't called the United Grand Lodge of England. It was called the Grand Orient de France. And in the United States, you have 50, well, not that time, but now you have 50 Grand Lodges with, all hailing back from the United Grand Lodge of England. Well, the problem came in 1869 for two reasons. So the first reason is that, excuse me. The first reason is that the Grand Lodge of Louisiana decided to, follow what was happening with the rest of the Grand Lodges, and there was Prince Hall Masonry at this time. It was right after the Civil War, and the Grand Orient de France recognized a lodge that allowed a Black gentleman into their obedience, and the United Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Lodge of the other Grand Lodges didn't like that. They thought that was a violation of the sovereignty of the various lodges. And so a lot of Grand Lodges across the United States withdrew the recognition of the Grand Orient de France. And then you'll see that United Grand Lodge of England didn't like that. They didn't quite yet pull it, but it was causing attention. So you'll see that the initial schism was not unanimous in the United States. Many American Grand Lodges continued to recognize the Grand Orient de France up into the late 1900s. And then you'll see that it will pull back and kind of ebb and flow. The unique thing about Grand Lodges is that, like here in the United States, you have 50 Grand Lodges, and they all are going to follow their they follow the main idea of United Grand Lodge of England, but they have interpretations. So our more progressive states, they don't care if you're Jewish or Christian or black or white. They don't care. They allow those individuals, and they don't allow women of any color or but they do allow that. Our more conservative states, not necessarily. I know Grand Lodge of Georgia and Mississippi, Alabama, kind of those southern places, they still struggle with the division of white versus black and the segregation. So universal co-masonry, interestingly enough, it does not, one moment, sorry. Sorry, had a little bit of a technical difficulty. So universal co-masonry isn't has nothing to do with the 50 Grand Lodges of the United States, and it's specifically the United States because our international headquarters is in Colorado, here in the U.S. So this is where we start to see kind of a divergence. We're not a part of this history, but it is an important part because we are a part of, or we're a part of the Grand Orient de France. So this was the first part of that schism where you're starting to see tensions between United Grand Lodge of England and its subsidiaries and the 50 Grand Lodges, and then with the Grand Orient de France. Now, when we look at what really broke the relationship between the Grand Orient de France and the United Grand Lodge of England was that the Grand Orient de France decided back in 1877 that it would no longer require its members to believe in the supreme being. It did not have to be a being. They didn't have to believe in anything higher. This is where we start to see the separation of church and state, a very secular approach to Masonry. Interestingly enough, Universal Co-Masonry is not secular, even though we do pull from this lineage with the Grand Orient de France. So you see that the United Grand Lodge of England does not like this. The landmark for them is that you have to believe in a supreme being. It has to be an anthropomorphic God. Typically, it is a Christian God. And France said, nope. We see that the state needs to be neutral and that all men have the right to determine their destiny, and it has nothing to do with this requirement. So you start to see that this recognition is starting to get pulled, and the Grand Orient de France is starting to be seen as irregular. Again, they're not following the set out traditions and landmarks of the United Grand Lodge of England. And that's where the schism starts. Again, we're seeing that phylogenetic, that Masonic phylogenetic tree just kind of start to branch off at this point. We have that strong trunk of the ancient mysteries where our roots are embedded in time immemorial. And as we start to go up, through time, that trunk grows out and we're starting to see this division. So just because the United Grand Lodge of England withdrew their recognition of the Grand Orient de France doesn't mean that everyone else has to, but there was many of the Grand Lodges that did start to withdraw their recognition. The tricky thing about recognition and withdrawing, whether, it be formally or informally, is it doesn't negate that people were initiated, passed, and raised under a proper charter. That's the tricky part. It's just saying that we no longer agree with what you're doing, so we're not going to recognize you. It doesn't undo any of the ceremonies, which I think that's one of the clinch pins that most people miss. I'm going to go through the next slide and I'll stop for questions. So here, this is the part that is, again, we're starting to get more specific as we get into universal co-masonry and advance in time. So you have George Martin on the left and Maria Desreme on the right, and these are very important figures. So you'll have Marie de Resme that was born in 1828 in Paris, and she will, a lot of these people were really into civic reform that came off of this branch of Masonry. They wanted equal rights for all people. And she was not one to shy away from women's rights in France. So she wanted a peaceful, acquisition of power. She wanted more peaceful advocacy for women to be accepted. And she became a Freemason in Les Libres Penseurs Lodge on the outskirts of Paris in 1882. So she was initiated by an institution that was, had its proper charter. And as far as we know, based off of documents and history, she is the first woman to ever be initiated into Freemasonry. Again, as far as we know, based off of documentation. Um, and she believed that she was a pioneer for women to come into Masonry. And she opened that door. So from the United Grand Lodge of England, you had the creation of the Grand Orient de France. And from here, embedded in that Masonic obedience, you have Les Libres Penseurs, that's the lodge. And from that lodge, they will lay the bedrock or become the bedrock of what is known as Le Droit Humain. So you see that there's this connectivity in the Masonic phylogenetic tree that LDH, as we say, Le Droit Humain, comes from the Grand Orient de France. And it is through the efforts of Georges Martin, who was part of the initiating process of Marie Durham, and said, women have the right to be in it. His wife was a part of it. There was a big initiative in France to bring women into Masonry. You'll see that we'll start to play the major hitters like Annie Besant coming into Masonry in the next couple of slides. But it was because of this woman here that you see Masonry has added back women. And I say add women back into it is because we know from the ancient mystery schools, sans rites of Mithras, which was all men, we know that women were a part of the mystery schools. Pythagoras in his school, his wife and daughter were a part of that school. We know that women were a part of the mystery traditions. And so that's why I say that truly the Dark Ages, there was this distinction that wasn't there, where men only, and then women were added later. We'll see that Marie Durham was the one that changed that. So I'm going to stop here and see if there is any comments or questions. We're good? All right. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead, and if you're coming in from Zoom, go ahead and put that in the chat, and Brother Benjamin will take care of that for you. All right. So we've seen a lot so far. We're going to take a break here from the early stuff and get into the modern era. This is where it really becomes living history for a lot of us here at Universal Co-Masonry. So when we look at the history of Masonry, we see it start, again, where it really started, we have no idea, but we start to see it come onto the scene with ancient mystery schools with their rites of transformation. We see it move through Egypt into Greece and Rome, and we see that through the Western esoteric traditions. And then from there, we see it go after Theodosius I put the hack to it. We see that it goes underground, and many of the traditions were lost or obscured. And I would argue that our brothers in the Middle East were the ones that held on to a lot of that knowledge, because if you look at the golden age of Islam, at the height of, I think it was 1000 or 1100 AD, you'll see that they had all of the records, and alchemy was definitely held within the golden age of Islam. They kept it, they made sure it was safe. And then through the clashes of the Crusades, that information was brought into Europe and into what we are now seeing with the history with Freemasonry. So we see it being carried through. And then we see that we have the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, 1717, becomes the United Grand Lodge of England in 1801-ish. And then from there, the Grand Orient de France, and then Le Droit Humain. So that's kind of that big stretch, that 2/3 of history that we will focus on. So when we look at Le Droit Humain, for those who are familiar with the history of Universal Co-Masonry and Le Droit Humain, a lot of people have a lot of different ideas, but here at Universal Co-Masonry, we have nothing but love for Le Droit Humain, in that they are a part of our history, and we would not want anything but the best for them. So when we look at it, their history, you have Marie Durham, who is initiated in Pec, France, and she is a lecturer, and she is an activist for women's rights. And then you see a lot of women starting to come underneath the banner of Le Droit Humain or Masonry with this gentleman here on the left, George Martin. He's very influential in bringing women into Masonry. And you see these mixed, as they're called in France, these mixed orders where you have men and women in Freemasonry. So 1893, you see a constitution is drawn up under the title of Grand Lodge Symbolique. I won't slaughter the rest of it. Mixed France, with its first lodge called Le Droit Humain. So Le Droit Humain now is an order, but back in its birth, it was one lodge, and it had men and women. Now, the interesting thing is you have this individual, and I mentioned her name before. Her name is Annie Besant, or Besant. I'm not quite sure how you are quite to pronounce it. So Annie Besant is a very interesting and polarizing figure because I have found in the last 2 decades, many people either really, really admire her, they think she's a charlatan, and I don't have an opinion either way. Ask me personally, I do, but professionally, I reserve that because I think each person should come to their own understanding of people in history. And Annie Besant, she was also a huge activist. She fought for people's rights and women's rights, especially. She has a very sad history. She lost custody of her children because she was so involved in her activism. She was incarcerated on, all sorts of different stuff, and she had a very rough life, I would say, but she was extremely impactful because she was the one that brought Masonry, as we know it, a theosophical blend. And it was through a woman who was a theosophist named Francesca Arundel that Annie Besant would become a Mason. So Annie Besant and 6 other women would go to Paris because Annie Besant was from England, and they would be initiated into Freemasonry. They were initiated, passed, and raised. And theosophy, which we were asked just earlier in the presentation, was something that came out of H.B. Blavatsky. Now, I kind of strain against that sentence I just made for 2 reasons. One reason, major reason, is because theosophy is an idea. H.B. Blavatsky brought it into existence. She was a great connection of the East and Tibet and the masters coming to Western ideology and philosophy. So it's through H.B. Blavatsky that you'll see through her roots the New Age movement come into place, and a huge spiritualist kind of revival as a counter-reformation to the Enlightenment, which a lot of people felt the Enlightenment was very sterile. It had been scrubbed clean of any spirituality. And so she was that link. And Annie Besant knew H.P. Blavatsky, and she became a theosophist herself. And when she and these women went to Paris and were initiated, passed, and raised, she came back to England, and she brought Masonry to England and formed the Emulation Lodge in London. And so she became a 33rd degree Mason, which, if you're not familiar with progression in Masonry, starts in the 1st degree and moves up. In our obedience here at Universal Co-Masonry, it moves 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way up to the 33rd. And the all male orders, you have to join different organizations to get the rest of the Grand Masonic narrative. After the 3rd degree, you have to go join either the Scottish Rite or the Cryptic Council, or you can join them both. And here we don't necessarily have that. And she grew to prominence, Annie Besant, and I'm really glossing over her history because she has a very, very well documented history. But the part that plays here is that she became the most puissant Grand Commander of the Le Droit Humain. And she gave this quote: "Co-Masonry has arisen from the bosom of masculine masonry in order to bring women into that ancient fraternity on exactly the same term as men, and thus to restore the whole brotherhood to the position from which it fell when it broke its link with ancient mysteries by excluding women from its ranks." So she was, again, an activist and wanted to see equality across the board. And she was the one that would bring a fusion of masonry with theosophy. And again, that theosophy is a capital theosophy with the idea, not necessarily H.P. Blavatsky, like you don't have to be a theosophist to be a Mason. it has some common shared roots. And in fact, we have articles and items of Annie Besant here at our library. I believe we have part of her ashes as well.
We do. We have a portion of her ashes. We have her Masonic gown and her Masonic gavel.
Yeah, so we have some important regalia and obviously part of our ashes here because of that strong connection to Masonry. So this is kind of an interesting story, and it's one that we, at least when I joined in 2002, and that wasn't a history that we were aware of, because for whatever reason, this gentleman, Antoine Muzzarelli, was buried in the vaults of history. And the story goes, and this brother is still alive, and I will not say this brother's name because many of you know her, actually. This brother one day we have a vault here at Universal Co-Masonry. It's, fire and waterproof, and it has very important documents in it, obviously, that we want to protect. Here at Universal Co-Masonry, we are all about preserving esoteric and occult and Masonic knowledge. So we go to great lengths to preserve what we have. And one day this brother was in the vault. I like to call it the vault of requirement for those who know Harry Potter, because we have been in there lots of times and you don't see everything. And this brother was in there. I don't know what this brother was looking for. But she came upon some items that were talking about this gentleman here, Antoine Muzzarelli. And it turns out, I'm going to flash forward here. This gentleman here, Louis Wazoo, if you had asked me back in the early 2000s, I would have told you he was our founder because that was written in our history. That's what we knew. But it is actually this gentleman who brought Le Droit Humain to the United States. And I think, even though his story ends very sadly, it's very important that he be brought in, and I believe Universal Co-Masonry agrees with me, brought back to the history books. And so Antoine Muzzarelli, there were some letters that were found in our vault, and he came on the scene, and we had no idea. And there's a book that one of our members wrote, On Holy Ground by Karen Kidd, that talks more in depth about this particular experience. But Antoine Muzzarelli, he was French in origin, but what he would do, he was a journalist, a reporter, and he came from France to the United States and brought with him Freemasonry. And from what we can gather, he had a sincere love of Masonry, and he wanted to see it spread across all of the land. And now, remember, keep in mind, there's the Mailcraft Masonry or the Grand Lodges. They're still very functional at this time. They've survived the Morgan Affair of 1826. They're growing in number again. And so they're still there, but the Le Droit Humain, remember, is going to be different in that it is going to honor the roots of an ancient mystery school. And so he brings this theosophical, adogmatic masonry to the United States, known as Le Droit Humain. And he works very hard to establish lodges across the eastern coast. And it's very, very sad because he ended up committing suicide because he had found out that some of the degrees that he had obtained was indeed by someone who was a charlatan, that he believed to be a charlatan, and that the higher degrees that he had were not real, quote unquote. And so he had breakfast one morning and he went upstairs because he lived above the place that they ate, and he committed suicide because he was so distraught over this knowledge that he came into, realizing that his degrees that he had above the first 3 degrees were not all of them were real, and they weren't recognized. And so his death was very tragic, and maybe that was the reason why he was buried. I have no idea why we didn't know about him until the early 2000s. But the room of requirement, the vault of requirement, works in mysterious ways, I suppose. So he worked very hard, and before he passed away, he worked with this gentleman here, as I said, Louis Wazoo, who was also a Frenchman, and it's through, so Antoine was really started it, and then Louis Wazoo would carry on Masonry through Le Droit Humain into what is known as the American Federation. And I'll explain what that means in a second. So Louis Wazoo, when he was first approached by Antoine Muzzarelli, he was a socialist. He wanted this work for the working rights of coal miners, and that's why he kind of he admitted it in his later years. He's like, yeah, I joined Masonry to kind of co-opt it for the coal miners and spread this equality and workers' rights and all that. And in a way, it co-opted him and changed him in a profound way. So he was hesitant to start at first, and Antoine talked him into it, and he said, okay, okay. And then through him, Theosophical Masonry would explode in the United States. In comparison, it's not as huge as the Male Craft. You didn't see 480 lodges in Philadelphia and Charleroi. Like, it wasn't that big. But comparatively, like for other organizations, it just was overwhelmingly because there was a lot of coal miners and a lot of workers' rights and all of that. And then people were slowly realizing that this was maybe not what they thought, but something better. And he eventually realized this and started working on changing the rights for everyone and making it so um, that everyone could be a part of this and that everyone had equality. In 1902, he received a letter from Antoine Muzzarelli soliciting his aid in forming a lodge in Wazoo's home of Charleroi, Pennsylvania. And this would eventually become, in 1903, Alpha Lodge, number 301, the first Co-Masonic lodge opened in North America. So in 1903, you'll see that first lodge came about. Is it 1907 that we became incorporated, or is it 1917?
1907, we officially incorporated as the American Federation.
Thank you. I always get those dates confused. So 4 years later, you'll see, as we were just talking about here, Brother Patrick and I, that the American Federation became incorporated in US law. Meaning, so when you have an organization as big as Le Droit Humain, it was broken up in regions, and it was typically done by country. So you had the American Federation, which is for the United States, and you had other federations of other countries. And so in 1907, they came here, members of Le Droit Humain, and they created, they didn't create, they incorporated, excuse me, the American Federation of Human Rights, Inc., with Colorado law. So we have been around since 1907 as a legal entity, as a nonprofit, but we had pre-1900 roots, but that's when we first became legal. And Louis Wazoo, there's some pictures of him in his older years where he just went around the country lecturing, and he was charismatic and he cared deeply about humans' rights, and not just again in that the coal miners, like where he started, it was universal rights. Everyone needed to have access to their future and their destiny, and that everyone, through this transformative process of masonry could do it. So he lectured all over the country, and very, very influential gentleman. After him, you have this woman here. This is Edith Armour. She was one of the most puissant Grand Commanders under the Le Droit Humain. So after Louis Wazoo was most puissant and passed away, you have Edith Armour. And she was a short woman, but she was feisty. And she had a very, very strong character. And unfortunately, we saw after Louis Wazoo, like I said, he was very charismatic. So when he passed away, the membership declined quite rapidly. And Edith Armour is extremely important because she was what got us through the hard early parts of the 1900s. She got us through the Great Depression, and she actually oversaw Le Droit Humain during World War I and World War II. So when the Nazis occupied France, Le Droit Humain obviously couldn't exist, and so the power was transferred over to Edith Armour in the United States and was housed here in Larkspur, Colorado, for the entire Le Droit Humain, all of the federations, until France became unoccupied from the Germans. The interesting thing is when you have fascist groups trying to come in, or if you see any type of takeover, Freemasons tend to be the first ones on the list because we're all about free thinking and free thought. And obviously that goes against the grain if you want a particular ideology and only one. And so unfortunately, when France was occupied, um, the Droit Humain, the Supreme Council in Paris, couldn't operate. And it was this woman here, Edith Armour, who oversaw that transition of power. And she gave it back after the two world wars were over. But she lived through a very, very hard time as most puissant. Um, and it was through her that we also saw the Theosophical membership. So you had a huge number of members that were both Masons and Theosophical Society. But after Louis Wazoo passed away, you would also see that decline where the Theosophical members started to leave Masonry as well. But Armour still encouraged people of the Theosophical movement to stay in the craft as much as they could, but eventually most members were just Masons and not both. All right, this is the part of our history which is moving into modern memory. So you have in 1983 to 1992, there starts to be this tension between Paris and the American Federation. Now, the interesting thing, I don't know if I put it in the slide, I have to remember, is that Louis Wazoo said long ago, back in the early 1900s, he wrote Paris and he said, the American people are a very loving people, but do not push them to do things they don't want. They are very free-spirited and they won't do that. So I'm going to read you parts of the slide because there's so much history in here. I don't want to gloss over anything, but the tensions that ultimately led to the split, as it's called, the split between Le Droit Humain and Universal Co-Masonry, did not start in the 1800s, but as I said, at the beginning of the early 1900s, when it was Louis Wazoo who issued the warning to the Supreme Council of the Le Droit Humain in Paris that the American spirit of freedom and independence could not be squelched under the foreign leadership. This was in response to the Supreme Council wishing to issue Masonic documents, so we have a lot of paperwork here. They wanted to move from English to French. Understanding his members, Louis Wazoo knew that this would not be received well and beseeched the Supreme Council to use English instead, which, to the Supreme Council's credit, they did. And after this slide, I should say, I'm going to stop for comments and questions. So you have this beginning tension where Paris is starting to say, well, we want things in French, and here in the United States we speak English, and so there was that tension. We would see that tension would still start to grow over time, and then in the 1980s we had most puissant Carlo Hack, who was the most puissant Grand Commander. Puissant means like underneath the Grand Commander. So Paris has the Supreme Council with their Grand Commander, and then the federations across the world have puissants, meaning second Grand Commanders. And she was the Grand Commander, puissant Grand Commander over the American Federation. And we have two positions. I'm trying to make this not very complicated. There are two positions in Universal Co-Masonry in Le Droit Humain. You have the most puissant Grand Commander, and you have the President. Now, the idea is that the President oversees the temporal affairs because we are a corporation with Colorado law. We want to make sure that we follow the tax codes and all that stuff. And so, excuse me, the President oversees the temporal part. And the most puissant typically sees the spiritual. And as many people who are students of history know, often when you blend those two, it can get very dicey really quick when money and spirituality kind of hit. And so in this case, Brother Hack was both the most puissant and the President. And there was some unethical behavior that she displayed. So she stepped down as President, but she remained the most puissant Grand Commander. And Brother Rosario, who's actually here on our call, she was the first President that would come after Carlo Hack. When she resigned as President, our relationship with Paris started to get tighter and tighter and harder. And the reason why this is kind of such a tenuous part, there's a very practical reason for the split, and there's a very spiritual reason for the split. And the reason we start to see the relationship between Paris and the American Federation to continue to degrade, that tension to tighten up, was because Paris started to secularize Masonic philosophy. And again, remember, we have very theosophical roots. A lot of our members didn't like that. Even though we had a decline in membership that were both Theosophists and Masons, we still held a very spiritual foundation. And as the French like to do, as we saw back with the Grand Orient of France, they like to secularize things, right or wrong. It's just what it is. And so there was tension, but the American Federation, the people here were like, we don't like it, but we'll still follow the rules and we'll still do what we need to. Um, when you look with the membership didn't like what Paris was doing, but they chose to follow what the most puissant Grand Commander said, which Brother Hack was in support of the Supreme Council and what they were doing. And so a small majority of our membership was with Brother Hack, but the majority of them went with her because she was the most puissant and they didn't want to, trouble the waters any further. Brother Hack would be most puissant for about 9 years, and then she would resign because she became increasingly unpopular with the membership here, because many found that her behavior was unethical and she received a lot of complaints. So this is where the division really hits, and you'll see it. And in my head, it plays like an epic movie because I'm sure it didn't have the background music and the costumes that I imagined in my head, but I'm sure it was incommunicable what the brothers went through as they went through this process. So when Brother Hack resigned, excuse me, when Brother Hack resigned, the position of most puissant Grand Commander became open. So we had to fill it. And what happens is you have the 33rds, which the most puissant is the 33rd. The 32nds get together, it's the consistory. So the 32nds get together and they vote on who, three names that, their first choice, second choice, and third choice on who would be the next most puissant Grand Commander. So you'll see there's an element of democracy in here with our 32nds, with the Sublime Princes. And so they get together and they vote to see who they would like to submit these three names to the Supreme Council in Paris. And the first name is Magdalena Cumcier, the second name is Brother Rosario Menopcal, and the third one is Vera Bressler. And so typically the tradition is that the Supreme Council would obviously take the first name given to them, which in this case would be Brother Magdalena Cumcier. What they did, which was completely unprecedented, there was nothing that laid the ground for this, they chose Vera Bressler instead. So when Brother Magdalena arrived in Paris to receive the 33rd and become most puissant, they did not install her. They sent her home and they told her that they were going to do Vera Bressler instead. We don't know a lot about Brother Vera Bressler other than that she was 80 years old when she was installed as the most puissant Grand Commander and was at the time inactive. Initially, she refused. She didn't want the appointment, but eventually she would accept the office. And despite the loyalty of the membership in supporting the decision, Brother Bressler would be the last puissant Grand Commander of the American Federation because that's when we see the final division. 1994. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. 1994. So this is where we see the final break between the two organizations. So in 1994, the Droit Humain and the American Federation finally went different ways. The Supreme Council told Vera Bressler that it wanted to have veto power over the board of directors of the American Federation. This is a big no-no, not just in Masonic land, but in the United States. It's actually against Colorado state law. You can't have a foreign body veto American board of directors. You can't do that. And the board of directors told Paris that, the Supreme Council, like, hey, look, maybe you're not aware of Colorado law, but what you're requesting is illegal, and we can't do that. And the Grand Master or the Grand Commander refused to listen to the board and denied them a translator. So they went to Paris, the board did, and said, look, we need a translator. We brought our translator. Let's talk to the Grand Master and tell him this is all a big misunderstanding. And they were sent away. And they were not allowed to have the interpreter that they brought. It was very, very tenuous meeting from what I understand from firsthand accounts. So the board of directors flew back and they sent out a referendum to all the Master Masons because in Masonry, you aren't a voting member until you're a third degree. And they sent out a referendum to all the voting members and said, hey, this is the situation. What would you like to do? Would you like to follow the Supreme Council and we would be in violation of Colorado state law, or we can split ways. What would you like to do? And in April 1994, roughly about 70 to 80% of the voting class members came back and said, we don't want to support the illegal actions, and we will split. So one of the things is a 33rd can make anyone a 33rd. You don't have to necessarily go through the ceremony. They can do it by communication, as it's called. So Brother Norbert Urzula, who was, I have met him, he is obviously long since passed, was a very funny man. He was very endearing, had a great sense of humor, lived in Detroit. It would be him who would give, he was a 33rd and a part of the board of directors. He would give Brother Magdalena Quincy the 33rd degree and install her as the most sovereign Grand Commander of the American Co-Masonry. So you see that there's this tension, and this lawsuit lasted for 7 years. Many of the board of directors were personally sued along with the organization by the Ladron Humane, and you can look up the lawsuit and make your own decision. The interesting thing is that the people that were loyal to Paris went to Delaware and opened up another American Federation in Delaware, incorporated it there. And it was that action that led to Universal Co-Masonry keeping all the properties that were here. Because again, there was a legal battle over who would get the properties. Initially, the people that said, hey, we don't want to go with them, the ones that do will give you properties that we have in various places like Ojai, California, and we'll give you this and that. And the other group of people that were loyal to Le Droit Humain said, nope, we want it all. And it was that we never reincorporated, we never changed our name. We stayed under that 1907 corporation. So the judge came back and said, nope, you formed a new corporation in Delaware, so you are the ones that separated from them, and you will not get any of the property. It belongs all to the American Federation in Colorado. So over the last 20 years, and I will tell you, the one touch of history I have of my own memory of this is I had just been initiated, and probably like a year, maybe I was raised by that time, and I was walking on our property here at Universal Co-Masonry, and one of the board of directors, who was also personally sued, came out of the administrative building is blue and white, and this brother came out from the top floor and was waving papers. I'll never forget. There was waving papers and just yelling with great exuberation, saying, "We won! We won! We won the lawsuit!" And I didn't understand the gravity at the time because I just joined, but looking back now, I can only imagine, not only was the thing that they had loved the most up for litigation, but also their personal well-beings were being tried. And so the papers waving in the air saying, we've won, and even went to appellate court, and you can look up the findings and read them there. It also, states that Universal Co-Masonry at the time, which was called American Co-Masonry, was not a new organization. And so the US law sided with Colorado state law and American Co-Masonry. So when we look at this is the brief history. And again, I am glossing over parts. I tried very hard to make sure I didn't gloss over anything that would, change the story in any way. We have in 2017, we changed our name from American Co-Masonry back to Universal Co-Masonry because we felt it was a constitutional change, which means that all of the lodges had to vote on it. So there's all different types of government in Masonry. It's not just all democratic, but this is another example of democracy and representative democracy, because I voted. I don't know. Did you guys vote in that constitutional change to change the name back? No, you weren't here yet. I'm old. So we all voted in our lodges, and the masters went to Grand Lodge, and they represented their lodges and stood up an open lodge and said whether or not they were for or against it, which it was unanimous. Everyone was for it. And the reason for the change to go back to it was because we felt that it represented all of humanity better than American Co-Masonry. We were truly universal. It doesn't matter what country or state or province or territory, it doesn't matter. We don't care. Universal Co-Masonry is for everyone. And so over the last 20 years, Universal Co-Masonry has worked hard to reestablish the beauty of the rituals, bring them back to their full splendor. If you remember, Edith Armour She was the most croissant during the Great Depression and the World Wars. During those times, people didn't have a lot of money. It was hard to do degrees, so a lot of things got stripped out of the ritual. That got put back. The grounds have been updated, lodges have expanded. So we've seen a lot of growth since 1994. So when we look at the history of Universal Co-Masonry, our pedigree comes through Le Droit Humain, which comes through the Grand Orient de France, which comes from the United Grand Lodge of England, which comes from the Premier Grand Lodge, which comes from time immemorial. It goes all the way back. And there's a lot of parts of our history that are very beautiful, and there are parts that are hard. But it is who we are. And that's literally where we've all come from in one way or another. So that is a brief history. I went really fast because I didn't want to leave off anything that was really important. But there are so many people, both living and who have passed over the last, 1,000+ years, that have really added to this moment where Masonry is being shared with everyone across the globe and looking at the equality of it. One of the reasons why Universal Co-Masonry gets, branded as irregular is because we accept women. Well, I would look at and challenge at the history of Masonry and tell me and say, why can't women be a part of it? Why can't Black people be a part of it? Why can't non-Christians be a part of it? If Masonry is the story of humanity unfolding through space and time, well, humanity isn't just for one type of person, it's for everyone. And that history is very rich and it's very it's varied. It's very complicated. And so when we look at it, it's important to know where we come from so that we can understand where we want to go. And I truly anticipate Universal Co-Masonry growing great heights as it continues to remain loyal to the foundations on which it was built upon. I would like to stop here before I close out and see if there's any questions or comments from any of the platforms. Brother Benjamin.
I have a couple questions. First one, so if our name was changed from American to Universal, does that mean that we have expanded beyond America?
Oh yeah, I mean, Universal Co-Masonry is all over the globe. We're traditionally in the Western Hemisphere. We have broken into the Eastern Hemisphere, but it's all over. Le Droit Humain's all over the world. So yes, it's not just an American thing. It is a universal thing. It's all over the globe. Next question.
Second question, if we rejected French authority, how can we still claim continuity from the French?
Well, the thing is we rejected the illegal actions. So it was the illegal action that caused us to say, we're not going to do that. We don't reject the fact that they were Masons. It wasn't like, no, there were some spiritual things that they were changing and becoming more secular. And we were like, we don't like this, we don't like this. But we never went and said, we reject your authority on the totality of it. It was the lack of respect for US law that we rejected. So there is a nuanced difference between the two, which is significant. I had the opportunity, I didn't go into Le Droit Humain. I don't think I'd be well received there, but I saw their building outside, and there is a huge affinity for what they've done in their history. And I will always, and many brothers here, I don't think I've ever met a brother that has animosity towards Le Droit Humain. For our side of things, we very much cherish our shared history with them and have no rejection of the Masonic aspects that they did, only the illegal action of violating US law. Other questions? Brother Patrick?
Nothing related to the topic at hand.
Well, we have 2 minutes, so I can take a question that's not related to the topic at hand.
Someone asked on YouTube, what are Freemasonry's arguments against nihilism?
Oof, that's a jump out of topic. What is our arguments against nihilism? Well, if Freemasonry claims a rooted past in the ancient mysteries and believes in the destiny of humanity, it believes in purpose. All of this history has to do with the fact of people fighting for purpose for humanity. So nihilism is a tricky philosophy because it doesn't believe in purpose. It doesn't believe that there's a transcendent or divine purpose that was given to humanity. It often believes, there's optimistic nihilism that says, well, we create purpose, but that's insufficient. So the major argument is that if you don't believe there's any purpose, then why would you join an organization whose philosophy is all about the destiny and purpose of man? They seem to be incompatible. Any other questions? All right. That brings us to the end of our time together. I want to thank everyone for joining us on this Masonic seminar series. I enjoyed spending the hour and a half with you and sharing the history that we have. If you have any questions, you have my email. You're more than welcome to email me with those thoughts and ideas. And I look forward to seeing you in June. And please keep in mind that in July and August, we will not be meeting because that's when our organization goes, as we say, dark. We don't operate during the months of July and August. So I will see you in June and then in September. Have a great afternoon.